All right, we're going to begin. Good evening and welcome to tonight's STEM Cafe Supply Chain Puzzle. How will your holiday gifts get to your door? I'm Dr. Judy Diamond, organizer of the STEM Cafes for the last 8 years and your host for this evening. Our STEM Cafes are brought to you by NIU STEAM and the Center for P20 Engagement at Northern Illinois University. Thanks to the generosity of our patrons, we are able to offer this STEM Cafe free of charge. Please consider making a donation so we can continue to provide engaging programs like this one. If you haven't reached your goal for donations this year, please think of this program. We want our STEM Cafes to be available to everyone, so we are not charging for this registration. Any donation is appreciated, small or large. NIU STEAM refers to science, technology, engineering, the arts, and math. STEM Cafes are fun, casual gatherings where adults eat, drink, and chat with STEM professionals about hot topics and the latest research. We usually hold our cafes in restaurants, and we look forward to getting back there. But tonight, you're going to have to provide your own snacks and beverages and favorite carryouts. In the meantime, one of our partner restaurants, Fatty's Pub and Grill, is offering a 10% discount if you mention that you attended this STEM Cafe. For those of you who have not attended our STEM Cafes, our format for this evening is our speaker will speak for approximately an hour. During that talk and following the talk, you're able to put in comments and questions at that time. So during the entire talk and following it, you are able to enter comments or questions. We know that there are many experts out there in the audience to contribute to that discussion. But we will end at 8 p.m. If you experience difficulty hearing during this evening's STEM Cafe, there is a way that you can adjust the volume on your screen to your liking. This cafe will be recorded and it will be available on our website, NIU STEAM's website, in about a week, since we do need to make sure we have closed captions. Tonight, you are going to find out what factors affect how quickly or slowly a product can make its way to your local store or front door. Components of a single product can come from thousands of miles apart. A drought, a snowstorm, a factory closure halfway around the world can affect what's available at your store, and it is even more complicated during the pandemic. Many of you are still probably wondering why you had so many problems getting paper products like TP, and how the pandemic and delivery of the vaccines will continue to affect the industry. Well, tonight I welcome Dr. Christine Wynn, who will provide a better understanding of the complex processes that influence the products we purchase. Dr. Wynn is our own NIU Associate Professor of Industrial and Systems Engineering. She received her PhD in Industrial and Systems Engineering and her MS in Operations Research from University of Southern California. She received 2 bachelor's degrees from Northwestern University, Applied Mathematics and Industrial Engineering and Management Science. She researches optimization, operations, warehousing, supply chain, logistics, and data analytics. She focuses on methods to find the most cost-effective ways to ship products through the supply chain, particularly perishable and time-sensitive products. Actually, this is the second time that she has spoken for our programs. She also participated in a teen STEM Cafe a few years ago about engineering, so I thank Christine for that. Dr. Wynn, would you like to begin?
Sounds great. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and my presentation. Okay, so I hope all of you can see it. All right.
It looks good.
All right, so I'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining me today. I'm very excited to talk about this because there's been a lot of developments in these last few months and a lot of research even in how supply chain has been affected by the pandemic. And so it's a very, very interesting topic right now. And if you're interested in this area, I highly recommend that you be aware of what's going on in the news because there's a lot of factors that are coming up. And I'll talk about some of those today. Like Dr. Diamond said, my name is Christine Nguyen, and she gave me a wonderful bio and introduction, so I'm not going to go through any of these elements. But I do want to acknowledge the fact that a lot of the knowledge that I get in the last several years is due to being able to work with industry. And here are just a few of the companies that I've been able to work with in the DeKalb area. Each of these companies is at a different place in the supply chain. And so the more I work with them, the more I'm able to see how a lot of supply chain factors go into their own operations and how their own operations also affect the supply chain of others. So since I'm not sure where all of you are at with your knowledge of the supply chain, let's go over just the basics, and then we can talk about what affects the delivery of any product from getting to your door. There you go. So there are a lot of ways and there's a lot of levels of a supply chain. Well, let's just start simple. In general, you've got your supplier, you've got your manufacturers, some sort of warehouse or distribution center where you stockpile the product that you're producing, and then you've got customers. So your customers can be the people you deliver directly to, or they could be some sort of retail store and even online store. In general, it's very important to know who our suppliers are, and we depend on them greatly to get product to the factories. From the factories, after everything is produced, then they go to some sort of warehouse or distribution center. So it's at these distribution centers that you actually get your product, and you either get them through online means or you get them through some sort of store. So the supply chain itself is a network that includes every process that's required to get the materials, produce the product, and then distribute it to all of the end customers. Now, in general, when you take this type of setting, we typically represent it as a network where each of these arrows, that's a whole other research problem in itself, but each of these arrows represents transportation between each of these nodes or each of these levels. In terms of transportation, there's its own set of problems where you try to figure out routing. How do you route the products to you? So for example, I'm sure many of you have ordered from Amazon. So if you get a product, if you buy something from Amazon, Amazon needs to figure out how do I get that product from a distribution center to you? And they're not only just serving you as one customer, they're serving a large group of customers. So they're trying to figure out how do I route that to you? But we don't talk too much about that. Now, the previous network I showed you was a very simple network, but nowadays we are typically dealing with a global supply chain. And so the network is nearly not as simple. If we have customers all over the entire world, a good supply chain will have distribution centers that are fairly close to them instead of one that's really far away. So that way, each of these distribution centers are assigned certain areas or regions of the world to distribute their product. Now, the distribution centers themselves need to get product from certain factories. So the factories should be fairly dispersed as well. You would think that because the further any factory is from a distribution center, the longer it will take to get there. Just like how every distribution center needs to be near you, the customer. If it's further away, it takes longer to get there. And nowadays we have tracking, so we're always staring at that tracking number and looking to see how long it's taking to get to us. Each of these factors typically are assigned certain distribution centers to send their product to. From there, we have to figure out our suppliers. The suppliers is a really big uncertain factor. We cannot control where the suppliers are. You are the company, you have to choose certain suppliers, and you'll typically want to choose ones near you, but you also need to choose ones that can deliver the quality of materials that you need. They also need to give you, be able to deliver the amount that you need. And so sometimes you can't really decide where your suppliers are going to be. That's already established. And so a lot of times this is where it gets really messy. Now, this particular network already is messy the way it looks. Actually, sometimes in this, even when I have what I have on the screen, you can see stuff going from one country, leaving that country to go somewhere else, and then coming back to deliver it to you. And there are a lot of products that way. And that's because every product is made up of multiple components, and these components can be anywhere in this world. Before we talk about what can influence or disrupt a supply chain, let's think about what the main goal of a supply chain is. The main goal of the supply chain is to meet customer demand. So how do we do that? Well, I need to first figure out how much my customers are going to purchase. Once I kind of have an idea, and ideally, we hope that's a really high number, right? We want to know how much that's going to cost us. How much is it going to cost me to make that many units? Well, in order to understand that, I need to know what materials I need as well as what manufacturing process is needed. Sometimes both of these have to be decided together. There are some materials that have to be manufactured a specific way, and there are some processes that require certain materials. So this is where there's a balance. There's a lot of product design here. There are a lot of engineers, designers that have to think about what we want to do. For example, your phone. The material does matter because it needs to be something that's tactile. It needs to be something that you can hold on to. It can't be something that, the material is like really odd and it can't deteriorate. So there's a lot of products where the design of it itself really influences the materials, the manufacturing process, and then ultimately the cost. Once we figure out these things, then we look into what resources do we need. So if I understand what materials I'm going to need and what manufacturing process I need, then I may have already understood what equipment I need. Now I need to know how much do I need? How many different machines? How many people are required? All of this is going to help me figure out how many factories do I need? How big should the factory be? So there's lots of decisions going on here. Once we understand that, we have to also think about how is it going to be transported. So if a product is pretty durable, there's no time sensitivity to it, how it will be transported is not such a big issue, it's more just packaging. But let's say it's time sensitive. Now we have to think about what temperature constraints do we have? If it's a fragile item, then how am I going to package it? Is it going to take up more space? The more space it takes up, the more cost I'm going to spend on transportation without actually shipping that many units. So transportation is going to be pretty big as well. And then how much do I want to stockpile at a distribution center? And then how am I going to store it? Similar things, are there temperature constraints? So for example, batteries for phones, batteries for laptops. A lot of these items are temperature sensitive, so they can't get too hot, can't get too cold. There are a lot of facilities where, food facilities, for example, where they have two spaces. So for example, in DeKalb, there is the Nestle distribution center. So I've done a lot of work with them, and they have two sides to the facility. They have an ambient side where the temperature on that side, I think, is around 68 degrees Fahrenheit on average. And then there's a conditioned side where it is below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, or around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, something like that. And that's because they'll keep, for example, chocolates, on that side, whereas they'll have other things that can be held at a more room temperature over on the ambient side. So that actually matters because now you have to split your facility a certain way, you need more equipment, and you need more space. And then the last thing we need to also think about is the supply chain network itself. How many factories or distribution centers do we need, and where am I going to put them in relation to each other? Now, if you're interested in the supply chain field, you're going to see a lot of these areas. I'm not going to go through all of them because I kind of already just did, but all of these elements are highly needed in order for you to meet customer demand, but also for you to stay alive as a company. If you want to just spend a lot of money, sure, you can just to meet customer demand, but you're not going to stay alive as a company. So there needs to be a balance. You're trying to balance a bunch of different costs, as well as try to make money and continue to deliver products to your customer. So with that being said, what are those main costs of a supply chain? You're going to see a lot of text on this screen, but I'm not going to go through all of them in detail. It's kind of just there for information purposes. The first main cost is investment cost. That's setting everything up and expanding your supply chain. So if you're growing as a company, then you'll need to add more, you'll need to invest more in machines, in infrastructure, and all of that. Procurement cost is a big piece, and I'm going to come back to this a lot, especially when we start talking about the COVID's impact on the supply chain. Then we've got manufacturing costs, and I think you guys already know what all of that is. Transportation cost is actually a very large piece. A lot of companies will use third-party companies in order to do their transportation to get product to you. But there's a lot of transportation that occurs on the other side of the supply chain, and that would be from the manufacturer to their own warehouses. So they need to figure out that as well, because if you have a really large truck, the best thing to do is to ship that truck when it's full, because then you make use of the mileage and the person that is driving the truck. So that's what you would prefer to do, but it comes at a cost of time. If I don't move that product to the distribution center, you as the customer might not get it in time or in the time that you order it. So there's always a balance between those two. And then inventory. How much do I want to hold on to? Do I want to make a lot so I can hold on to a lot? And then I know I'm going to sell everything, or is it risky? Because that's risky as well. If I hold too little, then I might not meet demand, especially if there's a sudden surge in demand. That's actually something that happened right away back when COVID just started. There were a lot of companies that were, so the term is called lean, and basically a lot of company supply chains a year ago, I would say, were very lean in the sense that they tried to hold very little inventory, because inventory means I need more space, which means I need to build more facilities. And that also means that I need to figure out how much I need to, sorry, I lost my train of thought. So a year ago when it was lean, companies were trying to make sure that they didn't spend a lot of money on inventory, because that meant they had to build out distribution centers, and big ones. So they try to keep that as lean as possible. But the risk is that if there's a sudden shortage, either in raw materials or in demand. So if there's a sudden surge in demand, you have nothing to give everybody. You're short. Also, if there's a huge surge in demand, you're going to go through all of your raw materials and then have nothing. So now you still have nothing to give your customers. And that's one of the big things that happen. All right, so I'm taking an example of bread, and that's because ever since people have been on lockdown, I just keep seeing everyone make bread for some reason. So bread has been on my mind, and it's actually a really, really good example of what's been going on. So if we're going to make bread, there's standardly 4 different ingredients that we look at. And so let's say you're a company and you're going to make bread and distribute it. And so you establish 3 different bakeries, you've got 2 warehouses, and you've got a bunch of customers. So what could disrupt this particular supply chain? Well, what if some of your facilities had to close down? If this happened, it would directly impact these 4 costs, because you may have to start considering whether or not you need to invest in anything in another facility. Your manufacturing will go down. Transportation is definitely going to be impacted, because you need to reroute products. And then your inventory is going to be impacted, because whatever was there, you now need to move it somewhere else, and then also, again, rerouting it. So in this particular example, let's say both of these facilities had to close down. And so if this happens, that means those routes are now gone. So those arrows all disappeared. So now what I need to do is figure out, how am I going to reroute them? There's a lot of analysis that occurs at this level. A lot of supply chain analysts have to start thinking, can that warehouse handle more product? Do we have enough space? If we don't, we have to consider other alternatives. For example, do I rent space with a third-party logistics company and have them help me out? Do I have to build another warehouse? Do I just rent space from another company? And then this warehouse is now responsible to serve that second customer. Excuse me. How far away is this warehouse to that customer? All of the customers in that second node now are not getting their product. And so now it's been delayed from them. So yeah, production is less. Maybe you don't have enough room for inventory. Transportation routes are highly affected, and you might not meet your demand. So this is when facilities close down. Let's look at a second one, weather. Right now in the United States, we are approaching winter. Snow just came down today, at least where I'm at, and so I definitely know it's winter. So when we have weather concerns, transportation is the biggest piece that affects everything. But as a result, it will affect manufacturing, and it can affect your procurement from your raw materials from your suppliers. Let me go back to this example. Due to weather, let's say all of these arrows, these transportation routes are now gone. And let's say you were transporting things by rail, maybe you're transporting it by truck. So now none of these exist anymore. What we're going to have to do is realize, okay, so some demand's not going to be met. That fourth node for the customer, they're not being served. So I need to really see how my transportation routes are affected. So at this point, there's potentially a shortage of raw materials as well, and it's certainly not getting to where it needs to go. And we're going to have potentially lower production. So one of the things we can do is actually find another supplier. So once we find another supplier, we can route their product over to where we need it. The downside of doing this is that we may actually lose money by doing this, because this new supplier, I need them right away. It's urgent. That person might not give me the best price. So I may have to spend a lot of money just to figure out how to get more, for in this case, yeast to my bakeries. When things like that happen, the company has to decide whether or not they have enough money to cover that increase in cost, or you, the customer, have to pay a higher price. And so let's say I have another one for sugar that now also needs to be rerouted. I need to increase now my production at these two bakeries to try and route more out. So let's say these two bakeries, I can actually do that. So I can route much more product through. And now this particular warehouse, let's say I had enough space, I need to have it cover that last customer. Same issues though. How far away are they from that customer? Can they actually handle it with all that product? So a lot of it, it takes a lot of different analysis that occurs here. There's production scheduling analysis, there's resource analysis, there's transportation analysis that has to be done. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on here. Another thing to be aware of is that your supplier is also part of their own supply chain. So for example, if I want to make bread, I need flour, but flour is also part of its own supply chain. And so it's got its own farms and it's got its own mill. If weather is affecting me, it could also affect them. If it affects them, then I'm still not going to get what I need. And so if I'm short from my supplier, I still might not be able to meet my customer's demand. Another scenario we saw when COVID began was that demand increased for certain products. So Dr. Diamond mentioned toilet paper being one of them, of many. So when demand increases, well, that affects everything. There are a lot of decisions that need to be made. What we also need to understand is this increase in demand temporary or is it permanent? Let's assume it's permanent. If it's permanent, then there's a few things that we have to ask ourselves. And I only have 3 questions here. There's a ton more questions that you can ask yourself. First off, where is the demand increasing? Is it one region or is it everybody? Then how much inventory do we have? Because that means my inventory is going to be depleted extremely quickly. And then third, how fast can we react to this? So if demand is going to increase, then one of the things I could do is consider new suppliers, or I can order more. So let's say I consider another new supplier and they were able to help me out. And then I need to increase my supply from certain suppliers. So then I can now increase production. But every bakery or every factory has a limit. So I'm about to reach my limit. If I reach my limit, and I think this increase in demand is permanent, I might consider another bakery and another warehouse. So the reason for this is because if I really do think this demand is permanent, then I want to make sure that I start establishing my my infrastructure to make sure that I can meet this increase in demand and hopefully keep it. When you order something and it takes a long time to get you, it will impact your customer opinion, your own opinion of that company. And so if suddenly they can't meet your demand, then you might turn away. And so then if I invested in parts of the supply chain, it will be for naught because you did not stay as my customer. I didn't gain you as a customer. So it's really important for companies to react very quickly to keep you as a customer. So then this allows us to increase the flow of all of the units through the supply chain to get to you. Another scenario, oh yes, and then you also have to add more transportation routes, especially in areas that you haven't had anything. But let's say you actually had a new customer. So here's an example. Let's say right now we are shipping our bread to places in Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Indiana. But now let's say I have, for some reason, there's a bunch of demand coming from Texas. How am I going to adjust to that? Based on what I have with my existing customers, everything is in the Midwest. But now I have something in the South. I have no infrastructure there. So we have to decide, or the company has to decide, how am I going to react to that? Is that permanent? Is that temporary? And then how much of my infrastructure change will be renting and then slowly investing, or do I invest right away? There are a lot of big questions that we need to answer. In terms of transportation, especially since we're a global, most supply chains are global, we deal with a lot of different modes of transportation. So in the United States itself, I think it's from the Department of Transportation, they release a report every few years on how products get to communities. And I believe it's at least 85% of products get to communities in the United States through trucking. So trucking is pretty enormous in the United States. However, if we are trying to get product across the entire world, then you are usually going to have some mix of air, shipping, rail, and trucking. Typically, any particular product can go through multiple ones. So I'm sure you've purchased something and it started in another country. And so there's probably some trucking there, and then it probably got onto a plane, came here, and then got onto a truck, then got onto another truck, a delivery truck, and then it got to your door. There are some products that can be shipped through rail and others that can be shipped through ship by sea. So there's a lot of agriculture in the United States itself, for example, that gets shipped by rail. And then there's a lot of product that comes from other countries like India, Africa, Europe, China, South America that come by ship. And the reason is because it's just a lot cheaper. If I want to ship large volumes, doing it by ship is a lot more cost effective. Air is much, much more expensive. What we have to consider on all of these modes, though, is time. So rail and ship is a lot slower, but their capacity is higher. They can hold more. Trucks and airplanes are faster than the other two, but they hold a lot less. And so those are the things that we're always trying to figure out when we look at a supply chain problem. One of the things that happened here actually that I kind of want to tell you about was there was a company I spoke with, and when COVID occurred back in March, not COVID occurred, when lockdown occurred, I asked him how his supply chain was going. And he said this particular company produces like plastic caps on a lot of the bottles that you probably have, or baby food with a lot of those packs, there's plastic cap on top of it. And so this company said that one of the issues they were facing was that they had raw materials that came in, but it was on a ship and it was just sitting at a port. It wasn't being processed. And the reason was because at the time, we didn't know if the virus would live on a surface and for how long and under what temperature conditions. And so to be safe, a lot of product was quarantined at all of the ports in the United States, as well as other countries. So he had it here, but he was just like, it's just not coming. We don't know when it's going to go through the port. We don't know when it's going to get here. Another issue was that there was a factory in another country, and he said that they were also on lockdown, which meant that there was no production. So he said, all of the product we have in-house, it's all being shipped out, but then we're going to be empty pretty quickly because we can't produce anything. A lot of our raw materials are sitting somewhere. And the other factories that are producing other products in other countries, they're also not operating. So that's the kind of issue that a lot of supply chains were facing. In general, every stage in supply chain takes time. A good supply chain will try to make sure that the time from supplier to you is as short as possible. The more stages there are in between, the longer it will take to get to you. However, as the customer, you typically only see the time it takes from the product to go from the distribution center to get to you. And so in general, when you're ordering something, it typically comes from inventory at some warehouse. You don't necessarily see it go through the supply chain ahead of that. So one of the other main goals of a company is to get product through those first stages to a storing stage, such as a distribution center or warehouse, as quickly as possible, because at that point, they know they can sell it. Otherwise, you will see back order situations where the manufacturer will say, okay, factory, we're back ordered by 1,000 units. We need to get those out now because the customer already bought them and we can't even ship it out yet. So now that I've talked about a lot of the basics of the supply chain, I'll start talking about the coronavirus impact on the supply chain. On the left-hand side here, you see 4 bullet points, and I just took the main ones. There are a lot of other mitigation efforts in other countries, but I just kind of want to talk about these. So some of the mitigation efforts were lockdown, social distancing, having PPE usage, and increased sanitization and cleaning. What happened right away was that a lot of factories were just shut down in a lot of countries, and that was just due to lockdown. And so that meant that, at least here, a lot of suppliers and even the factories themselves, nothing was being done. And there was a company I talked to, and they said that they had a lot of orders, but they couldn't satisfy all of them, again, because the factory was closed and on lockdown. And they said that they were just draining money because they were still paying those employees. They said, none of this is their fault. We're still going to pay them. It just hurts that nothing's being produced. And there was nothing they could do about it because any other supplier that they had the exact same problem. This was a global problem. It wasn't just in one particular country or another. So it was hard for them to find another supplier quickly. And so with the factories being shut down, everything went to a standstill. And very little or no product was being transported globally. For the same reason as my previous example, people were unsure how the virus was going to survive. So you had a lot of products sitting at airports. You had a lot of products sitting at ports, shipping ports. So like the Port of LA, Port of Long Beach, New York, up in Seattle, a lot of those ports were just completely full of product, and it was just sitting there. ships actually were lined up. So Dr. Diamond had mentioned that I had got my PhD at the University of Southern California. So I called up some of my colleagues over there to see what was going on, and they said, yeah, ships are just lined up because they couldn't unload because everything in the port itself was just sitting there. So they had trucks lined up outside the port, just waiting to go and pick up something, but they said, no, you can't pick anything up yet. We have to wait to see what we need to do. So it was pretty tough on a lot of companies. The first thing that companies had to do was perform a risk analysis. So there were a lot of virtual symposiums back in March, February, April, even August. But the big ones were actually back in February, and I attended quite a few of them. And the main topic was how will companies react? These symposiums included academics, practitioners, companies, and we all had the same question: what are you doing to figure this out? And a lot of us were recommending things like, you need to first figure out where the kinks in your supply chain are. Where's the bottleneck? Where is that one supplier or that one factory where if it wasn't around, you would break? You have to figure that out first, because let's say you have only one supplier. And a lot of companies had this. They had one sole supplier for a particular product. And a lot of it's just because of proprietary information in terms of the manufacturing process. And so that supplier wasn't producing anything. So even though everything else was fine, not having that one supplier hurt a lot. So that was something that a lot of companies had to understand. The second thing was, don't be lean right now. The leaner you were, the more fragile your supply chain was, the more in trouble you actually were back then. They had to really figure out how they were going to increase their product and increase production, but it was really hard because, again, everyone was on lockdown. So that was some of the first set of efforts that people were coming together to share information, share strategies, and what to do. I'll share another strategy with you. There's a strategy where it's basically, if you have a global supply chain, you basically just start looking for suppliers close by. So if I have a supplier that's, let's say, in India, and nothing can be shipped over, so then I need to immediately just find someone here. It was worth it for me to find another supplier here, pay more money, just so that my own supply chain could continue to operate. Otherwise, I couldn't produce anything without that. Then there was a sudden increase in demand for a bunch of products, and this is a result of panic buying. And so this is your toilet paper and hand sanitizer. And it wasn't necessarily that people suddenly needed to use more toilet paper. Your need of toilet paper, I don't think, increased. However, it was a panic buying because of the uncertainty. Due to uncertainty, you typically stockpile. And so that's what was happening. You also had an increase of certain non-perishable items. And so that's your flour, that's your pasta, beans, rice, anything that you can get your hands on because basically everyone was thinking they were going to hunker down and stay at home for months, not be able to go out and do anything, which I can't say that hasn't changed, but it was this panic buying that was occurring. And so everyone was trying to get ready for that. And then work from home. So now that we're all working from home, here I'm doing a virtual presentation instead of in front of you, there was a sudden demand for certain electronics. So I remember I was trying to buy a webcam and I could only find a webcam on eBay for $200. So I didn't buy it then. But everyone was trying to get equipment: laptops, computers, webcams, tablets, printers, even just home office goods. There's a sudden surge for a lot of these items. And again, some of this is because you needed more of it, but some of it was just because of that panic purchasing. The agriculture and food supply chain, unfortunately, has been impacted quite a bit depending on the product that you have. For example, there are a lot of products, specialty products in particular, like strawberries, that are highly labor intensive. So when you have a directive to have social distancing, additional cleaning, and even just a result of certain workers not feeling safe and wanting to have rotating shifts potentially or work from home. Um, they couldn't pick these products. So there were certain products in the agricultural supply chain that from the supplier themselves, they couldn't supply enough. And that's where the main issue was. The second one that you guys probably felt or saw was meat products. So a lot of meat products, prices probably increased a little bit, you may have noticed, and there were less of it, less chicken, less beef, less pork, and a lot of meat products. And a lot of that was because of within the supply chain itself. So from the manufacturer of the distribution center, because of the same things and an increased need for cleaning and sanitization, social distancing. So if I have a factory floor where I could have had, let's say, 100 people, but because of social distancing needs and making sure everyone was safe and additional cleaning, I could now maybe only have 20 in there. I can't have 100 people. So now I have a bunch of machines or I have a bunch of areas in the floor that are not used. So so product wasn't getting to the customer, to the grocery store in the same rate as it typically did. And then the other issue was also just customer, some customer demands went up and some customer demands went down. Coffee in particular actually has gone down. And there are a lot of companies, for example, I was reading an article about a company in Hawaii where they highly depend on tourism. But this coffee company could not. They have a bunch of inventory still from last year. Right now is the time for harvesting, or a few months ago was the time for harvesting. And they said, I can't stop harvesting. I have to continue to produce my product, but there aren't enough people buying it. And so now there's a bunch of product just sitting at distribution centers because no one's purchasing it, at least for them, in their immediate vicinity. And so there are a lot of other things that affected the supply chain. So demand went down in a lot of areas. So because of lockdown, people aren't going to restaurants, people are not going to movie theaters. There's no tourism. And so this in particular, this really affects food. Food is being now trying to be routed a different way. And not only was there very little demand, in some areas or industries, there is higher demand or panic buying in other areas. So they have to rethink how they were routing a lot of their product. There's a lot of surveys out there right now on how much people eat based on food services and how much people eat based on groceries and at-home cooking. And so it's shifted. More people are cooking at home now. And so there was already product in the supply chain to be routed to restaurants and like Disney World and theme parks and resorts, but they weren't being eaten. So now that's wasted. Then you also now have this route to grocery stores that had not been established or not much product was being routed through. So now they need to ramp up that as well. And so you'll see, depending on the product, there are those that are short, and then there are those that are, there's a surplus of. And then also, kind of like I said, less workers in the facility at a time, less machines being used because of these three elements. So when you have both high demand for certain things and then needing to route things through faster, sometimes it creates this illusion that there's a shortage, but there might not be. And a lot of that's just due to that panic buying that people were experiencing. And there are a lot of those who are expecting to experience it that again. So in particular, what happened a lot in a lot of supply chains where certain facilities were closed down. And that was due to an outbreak of COVID at a particular facility, so they need to clean it. And then certain suppliers were no longer available. And so we had to figure out, what to do. The company has to figure out what to do. And then during certain times, there was panic buying. So when you have all of these elements, like I said, it creates this illusion that there's a shortage for certain products. And in some ways there are, but the companies have needed to adjust and figure out how to adapt to this situation. One of the best things that I've seen out of this is really the use of newer modern technology. Modern supply chains have these technologies that have allowed us to react and adapt very well. And that's something that's been very, very powerful. And you may even see a lot of articles about technologies being invested in, especially around this time. So some of the technologies that I'll talk about are, for example, the Internet of Things types of products. So this is going to be just being connected, suppliers being able to identify which of their customers they can't serve right away and being able to inform them in what and how much. They knew exactly how much each of their own facilities produced. Excuse me. And if one of their factories were down, they could tell their customer, hey, I'm down by X%. So I'm letting you know so that you know how to react to it. Every company also was able to figure out their own. We have a much better awareness of what's going through each of the factories now, because a lot of it is, there's a lot of sensors, there's a lot of RFID, there's a lot of automation, there's a lot of quality checks. So a lot of that stuff is available, right at the tips of your fingers from any analyst's desk. So any supply chain analyst is able to access information and see which factories are able to produce and which ones aren't. How many workers were able to log in or check in, how many weren't. And so then it gives them an idea of how they need to start reacting. And then what's also nice that now we have better access to computers, more powerful computers. We can run more algorithms to try to figure all this out. So a lot of machine learning, artificial intelligence, data analytics is being used to further analyze this. So I can build an optimization problem of a supply chain and say, what happens if I remove the supplier? Will I be able to meet my customer demand? What happens if this one factory of mine no longer operates? Then will I still be able to meet my demand? What do I need to do? Should I add another factory, or should I rent space and buy just equipment for that rented space and figure it out? Other technologies that people are starting to look into, invest in, is automation. And so this will help with a lot of products. So for example, when a farmer trying to get wheat has certain machines that helps them do it at a large scale. But there are certain other products where you can't do it at a large scale. So there's a lot of that now being investigated, and that technology is being invested in. So what are some supply chain mitigation strategies that companies have used and are being recommended to use? So one of the first things, like I already talked about, identifying supplier risk and identifying alternate suppliers to replace those suppliers that you've identified are ones that you absolutely need. Next is maintaining or increasing production while addressing safety. You do not want your factory to close down. You do not want that distribution center to be closed down, because that means nothing's happening. Nothing's being produced, nothing's being routed, nothing's being transported. So there are a lot of strategies that came out. So for example, doing rotating shifts, adding shifts on weekends, renting temporary spaces, so that way if their own facility didn't have enough space, they could maybe spread out into a temp space in a different building or somewhere else. Altering layouts. So a lot of that stuff was being considered. And then modifying your production schedule in a way where you can still produce and potentially increase your production even. Evaluating and securing alternative transportation. So if you're not able to transport your product, or now you need to move it more quickly, you can look at increasing your contracts that you have currently for transportation, as well as using third-party services. And then on top of all of this, which is more long-term than it is immediate, are the strategies like investing in additional factories if they think that that's something that they should do, automation technologies and things like that. So right now, even though there's all these mitigation of efforts, and there are a lot of companies who've reacted very, very well and very strongly, in fact, why are things maybe not getting to you? Well, in the last few years, e-commerce has been a rising trend, and I would say it grew exponentially in the last few months, because a lot of people are just buying stuff online right now. There's also an increase in grocery delivery services as well. And then on top of that, there's the holiday season. So all of these compounded, it's a lot of demand for that transportation network that UPS, USPS, DHL, FedEx, all of them are using to get stuff to you. And so that is likely why, as much as people try to forecast for a lot of this, it's been tough because we're entering a season now, at least in the States, where it's starting to get cold. So weather is now going to become a factor. That's already going to affect the transportation network. So there's a lot of demand on it. And with what I've heard, a lot of these companies have done a lot to try to mitigate this. But I mean, I still have a package that I'm waiting. It's been like 3 weeks and it should have been here a week ago. So it still happens, but you just have to be patient. And it's based on just how the network is created. So one of the things I did want to just briefly touch upon is the challenges of the COVID-19 vaccine distribution. This is an interesting study right now and problem right now because whenever you have a new supply chain for a new product, you typically have a lot more time to scale up your own production to meet the high demand for it. So that means you have more time to ramp up infrastructure, build the infrastructure, ramp up demand, and even let suppliers know that you need them so that suppliers can also ramp up their demand, or sorry, ramp up their production. So that's a big challenge. One of the major challenges of this particular distribution and supply chain network is the fact that production and or supply is limited. That's something that we've all been aware of, that they've talked about a lot. And the third thing is the vaccine's limitations or requirements. There are, I think, 3 vaccines that have been publicly discussed, and all of them have their own temperature requirements, storage requirements, and even transportation requirements. And these requirements are not always not specific to this particular vaccine. It's true for when you need to transport blood. So the blood transportation and supply chain network is also very sensitive. Plasma is also very sensitive. So a lot of those elements are things that are here too. And so, for example, the Pfizer vaccine requires -70 degrees Fahrenheit. And the window in which it is stable, or at least recommended, sorry, not stable, recommended, is a very narrow window. So when you go beyond that window, there is a lot of uncertainty. And so the great thing that I heard about when I heard that these vaccines were being developed was that supply chain was the next thing they talked about. They said there's been a team in place for, I think, the last year to figure all of this out, because they actually had to develop specific canisters as well as trays and units to actually store all of these vaccines. And then they had to figure out how they were going to transport them. This particular vaccine requires the deep freeze cold chain. The deep freeze cold chain is that -70 degrees Fahrenheit. It's not an infrastructure that necessarily exists in all countries. So it's something that they had to think about. There was specialized equipment that needed to be designed as well. At every transfer point, they had to think about what country that was going to be in, what weather was going to be there, and what window they had to move stuff over. And so a lot of different things are being considered and were being considered. And then the third thing to also consider is whether or not that final destination, whether it's a hospital, a clinic, like a Walgreens or like a CVS, will they need special equipment for that storage? Do they already have it? And then do they need training for it? And so there are a lot of different elements that need to be examined, need to be understood. And so these are some of those main challenges that I believe they did discuss. They definitely have a solution for. And so we're seeing it happen live, actually. And then even today, I saw already that there's an article about how that distribution is going. And so there's a lot of eyes on that to try to understand and see how that's going to work. But I will say I have read a lot of their own articles put out about the supply chain, and it looks like they thought about a lot of things really well and to understand it. And again, this is not specific to necessarily this particular vaccine. Any new product, any new time-sensitive product, new agricultural product that comes out, the same considerations need to be considered. And so that kind of just ends the talk. I didn't want to go too much into many details because I kind of want to leave some time for any questions anyone had. And I'm happy to answer any questions you had about this talk or even other supply chain related questions.
Thank you, Dr. Nguyen. We're going to give everybody just a few minutes to write in some of those questions. And then Dr. Nguyen will answer those questions or respond to comments that you have. There is a button on your screen. It should be so that you can, I think you might have to hover down the bottom if you want to write in a question. Is that correct, Christine?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to answer any questions. I think there's that Q&A. I think you're doing it through that Q&A button.
While we're waiting for people to write in some comments or questions, I have a few items to tell you about some of our future programs. Our next virtual NIU STEM Cafe is Into the Nano World, Enabling Technologies of the Future, and it's scheduled for January 13th, 2021, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. I can't believe that we're going to be finished with 2020. And we will have also, we are looking for some teen leaders for our teen STEM cafes. And so if you know any teens that would like to be involved in our NIU teen STEM cafes that we are going to be doing in partnership with the libraries, please refer them to my email and so that we can connect with them. We have these teen cafes where teens, for teens, by teens. So teens are making all the decisions about the topics and vetting the speakers and managing the STEM cafe. So it's a great learning experience for the young people. And I've been asked to mention our STEAM Studio after-school programs for students, grades 3 through 12. Registrations are available on our NIU STEAM website. We've put fun into our after-school programs with hands-on activities that allow for free choice and exploration. The small classes give plenty of time for socializing and one-on-one instruction with our STEAM educators. The STEAM Studio after-school opportunities are only $39 for a 2-week session and make great holiday gifts. Students from DeKalb County, families with special financial circumstances, are eligible for STEAM Studio scholarships. And if you go to our NIU STEAM website and put in STEAM Studios, the link for the scholarships will be there. So do we have any questions? Yes, we do. We have some comments. Okay. Let's go over to our questions. And you can jump in at any time, Christine. How is blockchain used to facilitate complex supply chains, and how widespread is blockchain among companies?
That's a great question. So blockchain is definitely something that people started investing in 2-3 years ago. And what's great about blockchain is actually it provides some level of protection between suppliers as well as who they send information to. One of the issues with supply chain problems is that the availability of data. So data is not as real time as we would like. You, as a company, still need permission from a supplier to get their data. And a lot of people just don't share the data, and it's absolutely understandable. And so blockchain kind of allows that to happen. It allows data to be shared in a specific way where it's more protected, and You can solve real-time problems. And so then in situations like this, you can identify risk much more quickly in some ways, as well as being able to build your models if you're going to use any models um, to solve those problems. So in general, I say that a lot of the companies that have money to invest in that have been doing that and are using that. Right now, there's still a lot of trust being built with suppliers as well, because you kind of need both sides across your supply chain. But at least within yourself, within you, your own factories and distribution centers, I have seen companies be using that. That's a great question.
Okay, our next question is, what is the difference between supply chain engineering versus supply chain business degrees?
They, it just depends on what that curriculum is. I wouldn't necessarily say there's a lot of difference. It just depends on the emphasis. So depending on which university you go to, the supply chain engineering degree may actually be in the business school. And so I wouldn't say it's necessarily incredibly different. Most business schools focus more on management, and then a lot of the engineering schools focus more on optimization analysis. So that's what I focus on. I focus more on quantitative problems and trying to figure out, kind of like what I said, if there's a full network, how do I use that network to its best use? Um, a lot of it just kind of depends on how that university decide to structure their programs and for supply chain. So, for example, at Northwestern, they're the Kellogg School of Business. Um, a lot of the work that I do is being done by researchers in the business school and in the engineering school. So it's there kind of both ways. It just depends on um, how they structure their curriculum.
I'm going to let you take the next one totally.
Okay, I'm reading your question, Catherine. Let's see. I'm saying inclusion of social impacts. Um, so, um, so there's a question in particular about manufacturing. So, what is the union employee exploitation situation? What commitments have we made to our stakeholders? So in terms of manufacturing at the factories themselves, I would say that I assume you're talking about um, maybe in general, or maybe with COVID. So I'll answer the in general first. Those are definitely some things that have to be considered. They have to consider respecting all of that and making sure that they're able to address all of those concerns. Um, with respect to COVID, that's why safety was a huge concern. I mean, regardless, that should be the number one concern, but they had to make sure that the contracts were fulfilled and were agreed to by both sides to make sure that no one was put in danger. And so a lot of those efforts were definitely put in, at least with a lot of the companies that I've talked to. That was the first thing they did. The first thing they did said, okay, let's talk to each other and make sure we're all on the same page and make sure that we're all going to be okay. And then for shipping, you had a question about what is the status of the shipping choice in terms of where a ship's registered, um, in terms of outstanding employee cases. Um, so that's a really tough question. It's going to take much longer than just a few minutes for me to answer that particular question. So with respect to shipping, where are the ships registered? That's a very open-ended question, I feel like, so maybe I'm not understanding your question. But ships that are coming here with product, they do have to send a manifest and they have to go through the same channels to make sure that the product that's on those ships are safe, are sealed in a particular way, or packaged in a certain way. So that has always existed and it still does exist. And if anything, there's more regulations on those items. And then in terms of so your second question is what's the status of the shipping choice in terms of outstanding employee abuse cases? Those cases, as far as I understand, are still going through the normal channels. There should not have been any delay, but it does again depend on each company themselves. And so these are really great questions because with respect to a lot of these elements, um, I will say that there was a huge concern that those things would not be thought of or be pushed aside. But at least from the companies that I have worked with, they actually went the other way. They wanted to make sure that all of this stuff was going to be considered and were still on the front page. There's on the top of their list to make sure that they were going to satisfy, or not, sorry, satisfy is not the right word, that they were going to address all of those concerns rightfully. And so as far as I understand, at least with the companies that I've spoken to, that none of those were delayed.
So are we ready to go on the next one?
Yeah.
Several of the shipping carriers have reduced transparency as to location data of shipments to
Consignor consumers.
customers
Yes.
to recipients. What's behind all that?
That's another great question. Some of that is potentially because they may not know exactly where their product is. I know there's been also a high demand on infrastructure to collect a lot of this data. And so that is something that a lot of these companies, are considering. They don't know if they can continue to pay for that service. So with COVID, cost became a big concern because they weren't making enough money. And so I have read some articles that some of these services were certainly removed if they thought that they just couldn't, they had to prioritize other things. Sometimes they just weren't provided the data. I've seen situations of where I saw something sit somewhere for, let's say, a whole week and said it didn't even move. But then the next day it was on my front door. So the tracking didn't even work. So it just depends on which of these companies are able to continue with that service and are actually able to update. There's also, in some cases, that once product could start moving, it was moving so fast they didn't track it. And so you wouldn't see updates onto it at all, and they just wanted to get it to you. And so a lot of times this tracking wasn't something that they continued to update. I would say now though they should be, and if they're not, then that's certainly a concern because you want transparency with your customers. And then so the next question, I think it's from Neil again. The failure of technology and its role in disrupting efficient delivery. Yes. So I've had several inbound shipments delayed recently because of unreadable labels that had to be regenerated by the carrier en route. This is a environment now that we're in where we have to be careful about knockoff technologies as well. We also have to be careful of companies that have cut corners just so that they're established quickly. And so sometimes that certainly happens. I would say there are certainly technology failures. I have heard of stories of people who purchased tracking software, for example, RFID tags for their product, and none of them worked. And so there's a huge boom right now with transportation, and so a lot of people are taking advantage of that and not producing high quality product. I'd say quality is one of those things that might be not as high as it used to be, because a lot of companies, their concern mostly is to try to get the product to you. So there might be less quality checks along the way. I think so. That's my answer to that question. There's certainly other issues as well, but I would say that's one of the main things that I've seen.
Did you take care of the one about the failure?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can we apply the supply chain concepts in the scenario of natural disasters?
Absolutely. Actually, there's been so much research with supply chain with respect to natural disasters that it's being applied to the current pandemic. For example, there's a lot of research on disaster response. There's research on what happens if you have a hurricane, what happens if you have a tsunami, earthquake. And how that basically affects the supply chain. And so that research actually is being applied to the coronavirus situation now. And in general, yes, there's my big answer is yes. There's a lot of research in this particular area.
How can the global supply chain be changed to become more environmentally friendly? The world is drowning in paper, plastic, and other waste from the global supply chain.
Oh, that's a good question. Um, one of the companies want to make money, and um, I think a lot of what fuels whether or not a company decides to be much more environmentally friendly is whether or not it's cost effective. There are certainly a lot of strategies and products that have been introduced, but they're not cost effective. And so then companies are not interested in adopting them. However, so how can we change more? Um, I a lot of it's technology based, I believe, or product based in terms of what you can use. And I do think that some of this directive has to come as something that you want to be a goal of your company. I think there are a lot of companies that have been doing that. They want to be sustainable and they want to make because especially customers are starting to care about a lot of these things. And so, excuse me, if a customer starts to care and they're not going to buy your product because you as the company are not adopting those strategies, then now it actually makes sense for you to start doing that. The other issue is actually how can they recycle themselves? So manufacturers need to figure out ways to better recycle. The other issue is actually the reverse supply chain. So the reverse supply chain is basically how can I recycle? For example, if you buy a laptop or a phone, now you have a battery. You should not throw that away. That needs to be recycled properly. So how do we get that back to the company? That's really hard. And that's one of those problems that a lot of people are still trying to solve because it takes additional packaging to get that one battery back to that company to figure out how to recycle. I think more effort needs to be put into waste and how we process waste. I think there's a lot of um, desire to do that, but unfortunately, I don't see too many people doing that. But that definitely needs to happen. Unfortunately, a lot of companies just they want to make money, and so if it's not cost effective, they're not going to do it. And I think more regulation potentially is one that could be used. I've seen that in a lot of research articles as being a potential approach. And then technology. We just need the technology to be able to recycle things.
If I could comment, in April we're going to have an entire STEM cafe on exactly that because I think some of us aren't have good intentions but aren't recycling exactly correctly, and because we sometimes throw dirty materials into these recycling bins, then a lot of things that could be recycled are not recycled. And uh, anyway, we're going to have an extremely thorough discussion in April on this topic and the fact that we need to do more reusing and reducing as well as recycling. So we're going to talk about all of that. But this is true. Sometimes people need incentives to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And here we have a question. How can merchants with multinational supply chains be assured that raw materials and intermediate components satisfy quality expectations?
When you, for any particular product that exists, the quality expectations have to match and satisfy the country that it's being shipped to or being sold in. So, for example, if there's a product being sold in the United States but being potentially assembled somewhere else or produced somewhere else, it has to abide by the regulations by the United States in terms of quality and all of those things. And then there's the company as well. In a lot of supply chains, especially in the manufacturing level, there are quality checks and quality assurance techniques, quality control techniques that can be used. Um, and there are also audits. And so what tends to happen is companies will go to those factories. Someone will go to audit them. And a lot of times they get a third party to do that. So it's not someone within the company, it's not someone from the factory. And what they do is they go and they do an audit. They perform sampling. A lot of times there's a very short notice of when they're arriving. So then when they get there, they have to go through the product. And then they have the specifications of what that product needs to be, maybe a specific weight, maybe a specific type of performance. They will request tests. Any required tests that need to be done on a regular basis has to be done. So then they look through all of that. So a lot of the companies will actually have a third party evaluator come in and make sure that materials as well as components are meeting the expectations.
Okay, we have another question. Can you share your idea on how U.S. companies become more cost efficient by bringing back manufacturing to the United States from China?
One of the reasons why supply chains have stretched so far, as well as into countries like China, is because labor cost is low. So that's something that needs to be addressed. One of the things that people are investing in right now is automation because it's going to be faster than doing something manually. And in the long run, it will typically pay for itself. And so I do believe that a lot of companies are exploring that particular option. How can they develop technologies and build those equipment here to do that? And there's actually a lot of machines that are semi-automated. So yeah, it's automated in the sense that the machine can do, but it still needs a worker to be there to operate it in certain ways. And so for an example would be like if you're going to do something one by one, but now you have a machine that's going to do it in batches. So that's much faster. You can do it here, but you still need a worker there to look after it. So there's a lot of research going to that now. There's a lot of initiatives with that to try to develop a lot of that technology. Um, there's also, so actually, you just maybe reminded me another thing that's been in development, and this is back to the question about recycling and reducing waste. There's a lot of research going into now for additive manufacturing versus subtractive manufacturing and a combination of both. Subtractive manufacturing is when you have like a block of wood and you carve out something and then you get your product. Additive manufacturing is like 3D printing, adding stuff onto itself. Both have forms of waste, but you can find ways to combine them to reduce that waste. And so there's waste being done at the manufacturing level. Sorry, I went back to that question. But to continue on with this one, there's so the same thing. These technologies are trying to be combined to help with a lot of that. Um, I do think that because of what currently is happening, a lot of companies are starting to bring their certain parts of their supply chain closer and back to the United States because they're realizing how sensitive their supply chain was and how fragile it was. And so there's a lot of effort I've seen now from some companies to try to do that because if it's here, it's still something that they can help with, something that they can have a better relationship with versus in other areas. And so I think a lot of it will be technology based to do that. And again, the incentive is cost. It was cost effective for them to do it there. But if we can make it faster here with the technologies that we have here, and build those technologies here, I definitely think we can bring it back.
So wait a few minutes and see if we have any other questions or comments.
I really appreciate these comments. These are really, really good questions. I'm going to keep thinking about them actually after this talk because for some of them, I think uh, I kind of have to go back to my little think tank and try to think about more answers for these. So I really do appreciate all the questions everyone's asking.
Christine, is there anything that you decided to take out of your PowerPoint because you thought there wasn't enough time that you think people might be interested in?
Um, no, I tried to gear the presentation in a way hoping that everyone would be on the same page. One of I so for the last few weeks, I've been looking up a lot of the most current developments with the the COVID-19 vaccine, because of all the distribution complications and potential challenges. And it's one of those things where people might think, okay, I think it's just, it's going to get here and we're going to be able to do it. But when you really think about how a supply chain truly is developed based on the product it's trying to deliver. And if that product is something that's easy to transport, easy, without having too many restrictions, supply chain is much easier to design. It's much easier to merge with other existing infrastructure. But this one's so sensitive, and you really, as someone who's been researching this area for quite some time, I really get to see how sensitive that is and how true that is, that the product very much dictates how you design that particular supply chain. It's interesting because there's three vaccines, right? There's that one from Oxford, there's the Pfizer one, the Moderna one, and both the Moderna and the Pfizer have low temperatures, but the Pfizer one has to be stored much, much lower temperatures. The Moderna one, from what I have read, again, I don't know if this is most updated information or not, but from what I have read, it can be stored at a higher temperature. So that's actually better for the supply chain because that means less infrastructure is needed. The one from Oxford can be stored in your fridge as well. And so then that's great, especially for more rural communities that may not have the infrastructure, the freezers to store the other vaccines. And just being able to try to get something from, let's say, an airport to a rural community by truck in time so that that really cold vaccine doesn't get too warm is certainly a concern. And I know they've all definitely have thought about it, but it's been an interesting past few weeks reading up about what they've been trying to do.
I don't know if you talked about it earlier, but I find it interesting about like turkey, aluminum turkey pans or something that is very seasonal. And how do companies deal with that? Because if you were to purchase a bunch of turkey pans early, where would you store them, et cetera? And how can you tell us a little bit how that works?
Sure. So there's a lot of companies that are very aware of that. So so this is a great season to be talking about that. So let's say you let's say I'm going to talk about chocolates, for example, because chocolates can be applied to this. Halloween comes up, and you know that there's going to be a huge demand for that. So production has to be started much, much earlier. But typically they can do that. They can produce much earlier just to stockpile because some other product is very, very low. There's very low demand for that. And so then, especially for mixed distribution centers, they can definitely do that. So they can stockpile in the winter stuff because the summer stuff is already at the retail stores. They've already shipped a lot of that stuff out. And so then, there's always this ebb and flow of different products, and a lot of products are more seasonal than you think. So that's one. And then once Halloween is done, they already have stockpiled candies and all that for the winter season. So you've got Thanksgiving, you've got Christmas, and you've got same chocolate, but it's got a different wrapping to it. Same thing. And so they spread it out a certain way, and they have this is from demand forecasting, looking at past data to see how much they can do. And so there's stockpiles going on kind of everywhere. And if they don't have enough space themselves, they'll actually store it with third-party services. They'll rent out some space for some time just to stockpile it, and they have a contract for that time, and then they ship everything out. And so there's a lot of products like that.
So if I store some of those turkey pans, you would make a deal with me maybe that I don't have to pay for them until I use them? Is that
Sure.
right? I mean, is that one of the things they do?
So if you store them, then I pay you for storing them. And then when I need them, I'll let you know when I need them and we ship it out, basically.
Okay. All right, we have some more questions here. Does Professor Wynn have any thoughts on how smaller merchants might be able to best compete with Amazon and Walmart, which have such superiority of scale, both in procurement and distribution, and technology resources?
Oh, that is a tough question. Yes, smaller businesses are going through a tough time right now because they just cannot produce at the scale of Walmart, Amazon, or any of that. And um, I I don't know. Unfortunately, this is actually a question I don't know how to answer this question because the issue is there. Um, I have seen so the other issue actually with smaller merchants trying to compete with Amazon and Walmart is that if you try to do it online now, it's also tough because the United States, I think it was a year or two ago, they now have regulations that you have to collect sales tax based on where the customer is. And that honestly was a nightmare for smaller merchants because there was no technology to help them collect that information. And just so that, and just trying to file the information with the government that, okay, yes, this much sales tax I collected because that person who purchased it from me was in California and I'm in Illinois. So I used, you had to make sure you use the right sales tax and all that. Just being able to file the information was extremely expensive. And so I really feel for smaller merchants because that infrastructure is still not better. That technology is still not better. It doesn't exist. Amazon can collect all that information because they have the technology to do it. But if you're a smaller merchant, you have to do it by hand. You have to try to collect that information by hand, do it in Excel. And per state, you actually have to file it. Each state has a different fee. Each state has different system to file it. There's no one place you can just go and file all the information. So I really feel for them because going online would have been the greatest thing to do for them because then you can reach more people. Um, but then that caused an issue as well in terms of them being able to compete with companies like Amazon, Walmart, and such. Um, I think there's a lot to be said about having customization. There's a lot in terms of quality is a big thing too. So Amazon has so many sellers on there right now that um, I'm much more careful when I buy on Amazon because there's a lot of scams and other issues that go on through Amazon as well. If you look at any particular listing and it has, you typically will probably click on the listing because it has, 4.8 stars based on the reviews. But there are some listings, if you look carefully, um, maybe 6 months ago, they were selling something completely different. And the reviews correspond to a completely different product. And somehow they were able to convert that listing to sell whatever it is that you were thinking about buying. But the reviews don't correspond. And then you also have users or companies from other countries now selling on Amazon. So it's not just smaller merchants in the United States anymore. And so quality can be viewed as an issue sometimes when you buy certain things through Amazon and Walmart. So I do think quality is certainly something that people still look for, and I think a lot of it just you have to support your community, right? I try to do that. I try to buy locally. I try to support the small businesses here because they're the ones who are hurting. Amazon doesn't have to have my business. But the mom and pop store down the road, like they care about their customers. And so, um, I wish I had a better answer to your question. Now I'm going to think about this question all night because I don't know how to answer that question. Um, so sorry about that.
So I think you were answering the last part of that question, weren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you mentioned it because that's a concern of mine when I go onto Amazon. And if I can find it somewhere else, sometimes I prefer that because there are too many choices, and I don't know about these other companies or like what's going to happen if it doesn't come back right or they have my information. Um, So I'm glad you talked about
Well,
that.
even for example, even with hand sanitizer, when that was short, suddenly a bunch of companies just sprouted out of the ground and were selling hand sanitizer. And, I'm like, what are these brands? What are these companies? And then I think later on there was a report that came out through FDA that said, don't buy from these companies because they use a certain chemical that could um, explode, basically, or catch on fire. And so, quality is becoming an issue because, yeah, so quality is definitely an issue still, and especially any company that just sprouts out of the ground so quickly. I'm a little concerned. I'm wondering how they were able to do that.
Thank you. Okay, our next question. WSJ headline: One answer to America's recycling problems. Make big brands pay. The
Yes,
article covers requiring manufacturers to do just that. It is coming.
yes, I agree with that. That is something that I think we all have to be very aware of. Recycling, and like I said, that reverse supply chain is something that a lot of people are studying, like how do we get that waste back into the supply chain to recycle it properly, to make sure it's going the right way. And so I think there, like in Europe, there's a few countries that have explored that, especially with food waste and like packaging with food that comes to them. So there's a lot of smaller communities that are actually trying different strategies. Wish I had them off the top of my head to tell you to where they are. But I think that's going to be something that we have to consider. Yep.
Federal and state lawmakers in the United States are proposing bills to push companies to pick up the tab for managing empty soda bottles, candy wrappers, cereal boxes, and other packaging they use. Such rules could help pay for curbside collection and sorting infrastructure and spur companies to design packaging that is easier to recycle, lawmakers say.
Yes. Yes to all that. I hope that would be so. I think, like Dr. Diamond said, you know, there needs to be an incentive. Someone needs to push people a little bit to do that. And I think this would be one of those ways to help with that. Um, and even just more awareness of how to reuse and recycle. Um, I was listening to a podcast that I was describing how there are certain products where you could spend the time to clean it out because there are certain bottles or plastic containers where if you don't clean it out, they can't even recycle it. And so just having that understanding. Then there's a whole argument about, well, are you wasting water to try to clean it out? So, there's, the whole recycling paradigm is a very, it's something that needs to be studied more. There needs to be more awareness of that. And I agree, it needs to be easier to do, I think, in order for people to be able to fuel that. Basically, if you have curbside collection and sorting, it will help make it so much easier. So I think we've seen some smaller strategies for that. So like if you go to certain areas, the trash cans are designed in a way with slots so that only specific things can go through them, right? So ideally, cans can only go through the cans, bottles going through the bottles, paper can only go through the paper slide. So there are efforts like that to try to have more sorting that occurs here. But even if you sort them, sometimes, like I said, if you don't clean them out a certain way, there are some products that just can't, they say they can't recycle them. So then what about the technology itself for recycling? Can we improve that? Is there some way that maybe they do the cleaning and then that separates it out? So, there's a lot of areas I think that there can be some more research and technology development as well.
I find it interesting, other countries have much stricter rules on this, I think, than we do because we like to have a lot more individual decision making. But I think it was 2003 that I was traveling in Europe and asked somebody for a bag, and I was about slapped over it. Like, what do you mean you're asking for a bag? And, where is your bag? You're supposed to be carrying your own. I mean, that was in 2003. So I realized that people had kind of a poor perception of people in the United States, and I needed to clean up my act. I did notice after I scheduled this STEM Cafe for April about recycling, that on campus I was finding recycling bins that had a great big tape over them that said trash, and they were
Interesting.
recycling bins. And then I talked to Waste Management, and they're saying that if they find any garbage in a recycling bin, they will not take
Yep.
it. It is trash, and so it is critical not to put like pizza boxes with grease in there, or any bottles like you're saying that have any food in it. No food
Hmm.
or contamination can be in there, because all the rest of the recycling efforts that we just tried are no good because they become trash. So
Yep.
we have to be very careful of that. And in April, they're going to talk about, well, what is the proper way of recycling? Because I think we're trying to do what we have to do. And I think when China decided that they weren't going to take all of our trash anymore,
Hmm.
that was, I think that people started thinking about, oh my God, really? You know, is all of our trash being sent over there? And what do we have to do to be more responsible? So I think we have a lot of relearning to do. Uh,
Also, every community has their own facilities, and those facilities will, somewhere City Hall, somewhere it should tell you what can be recycled. So, for example, here, like there was a town where they said they would take plastic bags, but then the one I'm in now, they don't take plastic bags. And so, same thing, if they see plastic bags in there, they're like, we can't sort it, we can't do anything with it. This is basically trash now. So, definitely look into what your city can actually recycle or will take for recycling. Because if you put anything again that they can't recycle, a lot of that stuff just gets tagged as trash.
and my last thing on that is Courtney Gallagher from our university and also Waste Management are going to participate in that. Um, so let's see the next question, comment here. Chicago is the turkey pan capital, so we're going back to the turkey pans of the world. And cost of production of pans is critical. So turkey pans are produced year round and stored nested until seasonal demand hits.
That makes sense. When you have that much of a high demand, you have to make it all year round.
And here is another comment. Paper is probably the number one recycled product. One of the largest paper mills in the world uh, makes TP
Toilet
and
paper and
napkins out of 100% recycled. So that's good. Um, and Waste Management has recycling plants in the Chicago area. However, Pyrex glass with plastic between cannot be recycled. So, so I think it is good, like you're saying, that we need to go back to. I think every community is supposed to have online or something information about what is recycled
hmm
and rules to follow. And I think we just need to probably go back to, and that's part of what we're going to be talking about is, you know, are we doing it right? But it's not only going to be about recycling, but we forget to reuse things.
Yep.
And I just want to say one of the manufacturers, I want to say she is no longer the head of, I want to say it's REI. She was the chief officer there. She was actually having, no, it wasn't REI, it's Patagonia.
Mm.
They were taking some of, actually selling in the stores like REI, reused clothing.
Hmm.
So, and they were selling that. And I think a lot of our young people are really thinking better than some of those that are my age that about being happy with reused things rather than spending and just filling our environment with lots of things that we don't need. So I think we just have a lot to think about in that whole thought. But again, as you say, companies, unless they have incentives, the bottom line is how much money they're going to make. So,
Well, we also saw that with electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles. So there was a when that was first started, I think it was mostly California that did it, but maybe some other states as well. There had to be an incentive in order for trucks used for trucking, for transportation and shipping, to use electric vehicles, electric trucks, as well as hybrid trucks, because they didn't see any incentive. They said, why should I convert over? And so California provided an incentive for them to do that. And so they started doing it. Now we see a lot more electric vehicles. We see, electric buses. We see just electric cars that people are more inclined to do. And so sometimes in order to get something started, an incentive needs to exist. And then um, depending on how that goes, I think more people will follow.
Well, one final question I have for you, and I don't know if anybody else has any. Maybe they're thinking of some or writing them in. But so, why did you go into this field?
Oh, I haven't been asked that question in a while. I I've always been fascinated by how I got anything. I Transportation was what I was most interested in. It actually started when I was an undergrad, and um, I was downtown Chicago, and I was just looking at the trains, the CTA trains and the L, and that was what fascinated me first, to try to understand, why do they route things this way? Why are highways built the way they are? Like, why do we have traffic? Why are we always sitting in traffic? Why is the highway going through this neighborhood? And so I kind of started just looking into that. And then that got me to an interest just in the transportation network itself, which then transferred to interest in how it's used. And so it's used so much just to get products everywhere. And I think that that's primarily where it all started. And then my very first research project was actually about how flowers get from any source to your door. So I did a lot of research on cut flowers that came from South America, Netherlands, trying to understand why they were actually cheaper than the ones from California, but they're so far away. So then that started me on the journey of supply chain and trying to understand how it's so global, and how, you can get, apples from another area, you can get soybeans from another area, but we use it so much here, for example. So that's really kind of how it all started for me.
Well, I think that's kind of exciting, and I think people in our audience probably have young people that they want to encourage to go into these fields. So, are there a lot of opportunities for systems
Absolutely.
engineers?
Absolutely. Industrial systems engineers, you become so adaptable, actually. You're taught in a way to think of everything as a system. And so then, if you're able to think of things that way, you can think of almost any environment as a system. A school could be a system, a hospital, a clinic, a manufacturing floor, a supply chain, a recycling system. Any of those could be thought of as a system. And your goal is to try to make it better. And even if you make it great today, that doesn't mean it's going to be great tomorrow. And so that's the challenge. How do I design something? How do I improve something? And the other skill that you actually learn, and I think you learn this really well as an engineer in general, you learn to be adaptable, because we're taught that there's always so many changing elements. And so we need to understand how those things affect whatever it is we're studying. And so, especially right now, I have a lot of students asking, what good job can I get right now? There's a lot of demand right now for supply chain analysts, for logisticians. And so if you go into industrial engineering, it does prepare you for those types of jobs.
Well, I really appreciate the time you talk to the teens about these things, and I ended up having a conversation with you, and that's why you're here today, and I was very excited about that. We have another question here. Is the
Hmm.
supply chain that has been created to distribute a vaccine that requires super cold a one off? How can such a specialized supply chain be reused or will much of it be wasted? Good question.
The supply chain does exist, but in a limited capacity. And that's primarily because of freezers, canisters, and it's also just not used very often. But the deep freeze cold chain does exist, so it's already there. The issue is just that how far does it reach? And um, in general, it can reach to much further areas that are much hotter. The cold supply chain just might not be as more developed, and there just might be more stages in between each step. So there's more transfer points. Maybe they use dry ice more, but in general, that supply chain does exist. I don't think it's just going to be a one-off. I think it's something that it has been used. The concern with the current vaccine is that the product itself is so sensitive. A lot of other products that are on the deep freeze cold chain are not nearly as sensitive. And if anything, the demand is not very high. The issue with this one is the demand is so high. Basically, the way they're viewing it is everyone is demand. Every person is a demand. And so the concern mostly is how quickly can I get stuff on that supply chain. And so um, that's mostly the concern. I would say I'm more curious about the equipment that they've developed. So like the freezers, the canisters, and such. Um, what will that be used for? So that I don't know. What we understand right now is that there's 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine, and so will be used for a while. I haven't seen anything about whether there needs to be a second vaccine or not, um, meaning that this is going to be an annual thing like the flu. I have no idea. So if that becomes something that has to happen, then we'll see this supply chain be used much more often. What's interesting about the supply chain also with the vaccine is that the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine use RNA. And so that's the technology that's being used for the vaccine, which is why it needs to be held so cold, especially the Pfizer one. And so, does this mean that there are other vaccines that can be developed using the same technology? If there is, then maybe they will make use of this supply chain. So that's a great question. It's something that I think a lot of people have been asking as well. Well, how much of the investment into developing the canisters, developing the trays to hold this vaccine will actually be reused? Because I think it's one canister or one tray was like $30,000 or something. It's extremely expensive, um, and so that's a great question. From my understanding, at least the supply chain will be reused. The equipment on it, that's what's up for question.
Um, I guess one of the final things I have a question about and like you to answer is what about the future? And maybe you answered this already at some point, but maybe you can just cap it off. Like, just how is the future of supply chain going to be different? What are the newest things that we have to look forward to? And what have we learned from this experience, which is not over yet? But, but certainly, we've learned something. And so there's always a silver lining to everything we do. So there have to be some really positive things that have happened because of this. And what are some of those things? What will our future in supply chain look like?
I think companies will definitely invest more effort into studying their own supply chain and basically have more risk analysis and risk mitigation. It's been in talks for quite a while, but in terms of really emphasizing that as part of their strategies, it hasn't, because there hasn't been a need for it. Now there has. And I think every company has seen how sensitive or fragile their own supply chains are. And so I think that's what's going to happen moving forward. I think we're going to see more companies change their supply chain, bring some of that back to the United States, not depend so much on supply chains that are stretched so far. And then I think we may potentially see a surge in technology development. I think there's a lot more effort now going into not necessarily just automation or those types of technologies, even just algorithms, developing algorithms to help them solve these problems more quickly, and trying to better understand, um, if something happens in their supply chain, then how do they react to it? So more planning for those types of problems. And so I see machine learning, data analytics, automation developments. I see a lot of that really surging a bit more. Um, and so back in that symposium I was in before, a lot of the companies that didn't want to stockpile for years, they hurt a lot. They realized that they said, oh, well, we can't do anything anymore. We should have stockpiled more. And so I think some supply chains will go from being so lean to now stockpiling a bit more. And then we'll kind of see after that. But in general, I would say that we're in a much better state now than we were back in March. Many companies, many supply chains have recovered. There are some that are still catching up. So that's definitely still happening. And but we're certainly in a much better state now, I think, than we were before.
Oh, here's another question comment. My company stopped using supply chain for the fact that they will not stock my product. So I am going direct and eliminate them as I don't see a benefit using them. They want a discount for not stocking the product.
And that probably hurt too. Um, I think there needs to be more analysis into the supply chain. I think it was Dr. Hauser who commented about blockchain. I see that being a technology that potentially being used more often as well, and more research going into that to see how that can be used. Because having more transparency across the supply chain will help you be able to understand what's happening day in, day out, so that you know how to react to it, um, and that you can prepare for it as well. So I think um, we're going to see a lot more companies try to stockpile product for some time, I think.
I just have one comment. I'm from the probably the toilet paper capital of the world. Not sure at Green Bay, and so we had a lot of fun back and forth with the family about the fact that we were worried about toilet paper, and they had plenty. So, um, I found that humorous, but also sad. Um, well, uh, I again, thank you, Dr. Wynn. I don't see any more questions or comments. It was a pleasure to have you with us this evening. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you all. Thank you all for your questions. Please feel free to contact me if you have any other questions. I'm happy to continue the discussion. Yeah, thank you all very, very much.
There was one further comment, if anybody's still on. One method we used was to negotiate with the supplier to pay for storage of their product in our plant.
Oh, yeah. I've seen a lot of companies who can't hold on to their own product. They will start doing that because they want to produce more, but they need to start moving it through the supply chain. So doing that actually helps them as well.
Well, thank you very much again. It was a pleasure. I've been looking forward to this talk for quite some time. Our next virtual STEM Cafe is scheduled January 13th, 2021, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Into the Nano World, Enabling Technologies of the Future, scheduled from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. I already said that. We welcome your feedback. If you're interested in providing us feedback or making a suggestion for a future STEM Cafe, we certainly welcome ideas. In fact, tonight's STEM Cafe came as a request from one of our longtime persons that has attended our cafes, and so we do use what you ask and suggestions that you give. In fact, this past year, at least two of the STEM cafes were those that were asked for by the audience. So please do give me ideas. And if you're interested in sponsoring a STEM cafe, or you know of a company that would be willing, please contact me. or go online to our NIU STEAM website to give. Uh, and you will find today's recorded STEM Cafe. If you go to just type in STEM Cafes at our, for NIU's website, and you will come to the recorded cafes. But give us about a week since we have to do closed captioning. And I want to thank Eileen Click's team. She is our NIU Director of Web Media and E-Learning, and her staff this evening, Raz Abdul Sarani and Becky Griffith, were in the background and helping us. They assisted us with our Zoom platform this evening, and we are very grateful. Thank you, our audience, for joining us. We would love to know again about those topics that you would like to discuss in the future. Please provide your feedback, and thank you very much for joining us. We hope that you join us again soon. Thank you.